The diplomatic chamber aboard the Kethvar warship Bonecrusher was designed to intimidate. Towering obsidian walls stretched up into darkness, carved with the skulls of 1,000 conquered species. The air reeked of sulfur and dried blood, a calculated assault on the senses of any who dared enter uninvited. Bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie green glow across jagged metal surfaces, while the constant rumble of the ship's massive engines served as a reminder of the raw power that surrounded this place. At the center of it all sat Warlord Grakthul, a mountain of scarred flesh and cybernetic enhancement. Standing nearly 12 feet tall even while seated, his 4 arms ended in claws that could tear through starship hull plating. Each of his 3 eyes glowed with predatory intelligence, and his mandibles clicked with barely contained aggression. Across his chest, the skulls of enemy commanders hung like macabre decorations, trophies from countless victories across the galaxy. The Kethvar Empire had swept through 17 star systems in the past 3 cycles, leaving nothing but ash and tribute worlds in their wake. No species had ever successfully resisted their advance. The galaxy had learned to fear the sight of their angular black warships, knowing that surrender was the only option that might preserve some fragment of their civilization. Today, however, something unprecedented had occurred. A single small vessel had approached the fleet under a flag of parley, requesting an audience with the Warlord himself. The ship belonged to a species the Kethvar had encountered only recently at the edge of their expanding territory, humans from a blue world called Earth. Intelligence reports on these creatures had been contradictory. They appeared physically weak, with soft flesh and no natural weapons to speak of. Their technology seemed primitive compared to the energy-based weapons and psionic amplifiers that dominated galactic warfare. Most puzzling of all, they had made no attempt to flee when Kethvar scouts had first entered their system. Instead, they had sent messages requesting peaceful contact. Grakthul had found their naivety amusing enough to grant this meeting, if only to extract entertainment from their inevitable terror before ordering their homeworld's destruction. It would serve as a fitting end to this campaign cycle before returning to Kethvar space with news of fresh conquests. The massive blast doors groaned open with a pneumatic hiss, and the human delegation entered. Grakthul's 3 eyes fixed immediately on their leader, a female of the species, unremarkable in every way he could discern. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her brown hair pulled back in a simple style. Her clothing appeared to be some kind of formal uniform, deep blue with silver insignia, but it conveyed no sense of the brutal power that commanded respect in Kethvar culture. Behind her walked 2 male humans, clearly guards despite their lack of visible weapons. They moved with a certain alertness that suggested military training, but their soft features and small stature made them appear more like children playing at war than actual warriors. The very sight of them drew amused chuffs from the Kethvar honor guard stationed around the chamber's perimeter. "I am Admiral Sarachon of the United Earth Defense Force," the female announced, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space despite its softness compared to Kethvar vocal cords. "I come seeking dialogue between our peoples." Grakthul's mandibles spread wide in what passed for a smile among his kind, revealing rows of serrated teeth. The gesture had caused countless enemy commanders to soil themselves in terror, yet this human's expression remained unchanged. If anything, the corners of her mouth curved upward slightly. Was she attempting to mirror his gesture? Dialogue. Grakthul's voice rumbled like grinding stone, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "Your species knows nothing of the galaxy, little soft thing. There is no dialogue with the Kethvar Empire. There is only conquest and tribute." He gestured with one massive clawed hand toward the skull decorations adorning his chest. Each of these once commanded fleets greater than anything your primitive world could construct. Yet they all fell before Kethvar might. The human, Chun, nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. "I see. And how long has your empire been expanding through the galaxy?" 7,000 cycles," Grakthul replied with evident pride. 7,000 cycles of unbroken conquest. Worlds beyond counting have fallen to our fleets. Species beyond number serve as our slaves or fertilize our crops. He leaned forward, his massive bulk causing the floor to creak. Your pathetic civilization will be nothing but a footnote in our glorious history. Rather than cowering as expected, Chen's smile seemed to grow slightly brighter. 7,000 years of conquest. That's quite impressive. Tell me, Warlord, in all that time, have you ever encountered a species that surprised you? The question caught Grakthul off guard. His secondary arms twitched with irritation at the implied challenge. Surprised, he barked a harsh laugh that echoed off the chamber walls. Nothing in this galaxy surprises the Kethvar anymore, soft skin. We have seen every form of resistance, every desperate strategy, every pitiful attempt at defiance. They all end the same way, in flames and screaming. Fascinating, Chen replied, clasping her hands behind her back in a relaxed posture that should have been impossible given the circumstances. We've studied your conquest patterns during our approach to this system. Your tactics are indeed formidable against conventional military forces. Grakthul's eyes narrowed. There was something in the human's tone, a note of clinical assessment that was unusual. Most species either begged for mercy or issued hollow threats at this point in the proceedings. This creature seemed to be taking notes. Your psychological warfare techniques are particularly effective, Chun continued conversationally. The intimidating ship designs, the gruesome trophy displays, the calculated brutality of your initial strikes. It's a comprehensive approach designed to break enemy morale before actual combat even begins. Quite sophisticated, really. The Warlord's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of growing agitation among his kind. You speak as if you are not afraid, human. That is foolishness beyond measure. My fleet carries enough firepower to crack your world's crust and boil away its oceans. Oh, I'm certain it does, Chen agreed readily. Your dreadnoughts alone mass approximately 40 million tons each, if our scans are accurate. The energy output of your primary weapons could indeed sterilize large portions of a planetary surface. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Though I notice your conquest records show you prefer to leave worlds relatively intact for resource extraction purposes. Grakthul's primary eye began to glow more intensely, a physiological response to rising anger. Your analysis means nothing in the face of superior force, insect. I have crushed civilizations that spanned hundreds of systems. What could your single, backwards world possibly do against the might of the Kethvar Empire? For the first time since entering the chamber, Chen's smile reached her eyes. It was a warm, almost maternal expression that seemed utterly out of place in this temple of conquest and death. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of gentle amusement that made Grakthul's secondary hearts skip a beat for reasons he couldn't understand. Warlord Grakthul, she said, her tone as pleasant as if they were discussing the weather. Has it ever occurred to you to wonder why, in all your thousands of years of conquest, you've never encountered a species quite like humanity? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Grakthul's four arms flexed unconsciously, claws extending as his warrior instincts responded to something his conscious mind couldn't quite identify. There was no threat in the human's posture, no hidden weapon or concealed technology that his enhanced senses could detect. Yet something primitive deep within his combat-hardened psyche was beginning to sound alarm bells. "Speak plainly, soft thing," he growled, leaning forward until his massive bulk loomed over the small human figure. "Your riddles grow tiresome." Chen's smile never wavered. If anything, it seemed to brighten further, and, when she spoke, her words carried the cheerful certainty of someone sharing an obvious truth. "Because, Warlord," she said softly, "we're not the prey species you're accustomed to hunting." The chamber fell silent except for the distant thrum of the ship's engines. Grakthul's three eyes studied the human intently, searching for any sign of the fear or desperation he was accustomed to seeing at this point in such encounters. Instead, he found only that maddeningly serene smile and eyes that held something he was beginning to recognize as confidence. "Impossible," he rumbled, though his voice lacked some of its earlier certainty. "Your species possesses no superior technology, no psionic abilities, no physical advantages. Our preliminary scans confirmed you're nothing but soft flesh and primitive tools." "Your scans were accurate," Chen confirmed with a nod. "We are indeed soft, relatively weak, and our technology is primitive by galactic standards." She paused, her smile taking on an almost predatory edge. "But you made a critical error in your assessment, Warlord." "And what error is that?" Grakthal demanded, though he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Chen's expression remained perfectly pleasant as she delivered her response with the casual tone of someone pointing out a minor mathematical miscalculation. "You assumed we were planning to fight you." The words hit Grakthal like a physical blow. In 7,000 years of conquest, every species his empire had encountered had either fled in terror or prepared for military resistance. The concept of a third option was so foreign to his worldview that for a moment, his enhanced mind simply couldn't process it. "Not fight?" he repeated slowly, his mandibles clicking in confusion. "Then, what?" He never finished the question. Chen's smile had transformed into something that made his primary nervous system flood with stress hormones for reasons his warrior's mind couldn't comprehend. It was still pleasant, still warm, but there was something else there now, something ancient and predatory that had nothing to do with physical prowess or technological superiority. "Warlord Grakthal," Chen said, her voice maintaining that same cheerful, conversational tone, "I'd like to tell you a story about a species that evolved not as apex predators, but as persistence hunters on a world where the prey was faster, stronger, and better armed than they were." Grakthal's combat instincts were screaming at him now, though he still couldn't identify any specific threat. The human remained motionless, her hands still clasped casually behind her back, no weapons visible anywhere on her person. Yet every warrior's instinct he had developed over centuries of battle was telling him that he was in mortal danger. "Such a species," Chen continued, seemingly oblivious to his distress, "would develop certain, unique characteristics. Patience, for instance. The ability to pursue a goal for extended periods without losing focus or motivation. Creativity in problem-solving when direct confrontation isn't viable. And perhaps most importantly," she paused, and for the first time since entering the chamber, her smile faded completely. When it returned a moment later, it was something altogether different, still warm, still human, but carrying undertones that made Grakthal's scarred hide crawl with involuntary fear. The ability to inspire absolute loyalty among their own kind when faced with an existential threat. As if summoned by her words, a new sound began to penetrate the chamber's walls. At first, it was barely audible beneath the rumble of the ship's engines, a faint rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But as seconds passed, it grew steadily stronger, more distinct. It was the sound of thousands of ships dropping out of hyperspace. Grakthal's eyes widened as the implications hit him. His personal communicator crackled to life with urgent reports from his fleet commanders, their voices tight with confusion and growing alarm. "Warlord, massive hyperspace signatures detected throughout the system. Sir, they're everywhere. Thousands of vessels, emerging from every vector. Energy signatures don't match any known configuration. They're not using conventional FTL drives." Chen's smile never wavered as chaos erupted around them. She stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, radiating an aura of calm certainty that was more unsettling than any threat could have been. "You see, Warlord," she said, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the cacophony of alarms and shouted orders. "While you were studying our military capabilities and dismissing our primitive technology, we were studying something far more important. The vibration had become a steady thrum that seemed to resonate in Grakthol's bones. Through the chamber's viewing ports, he could see lights beginning to appear in the darkness of space. Not the harsh white glare of Kethvar fusion drives, but something softer, more organic. Ships were materializing throughout his formation, but they moved with patterns that defied conventional tactical doctrine. "What did you study?" Grakthol asked, though his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. Chin's eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something far more dangerous. "We studied you." The tactical display in the Bone Crusher's command center showed a nightmare scenario that violated every principle of space warfare Grakthol had learned over his 7 centuries of military service. Human vessels were materializing throughout Kethvar formations with impossible precision, not in the organized battle lines that characterize civilized combat, but in seemingly random patterns that made no tactical sense. "Fit Amiral Vextar reporting, Warlord." The voice of his most experienced commander crackled through the communications array, barely containing panic. "The humans have somehow bypassed our perimeter sensors entirely. They're appearing inside our defensive formations." Grakthol's primary eye tracked the holographic representations as they updated in real time. Red dots representing Kethvar warships found themselves suddenly surrounded by blue indicators marking human vessels. The enemy had achieved something that should have been impossible: complete tactical surprise against a fleet that had perfected the art of war across millennia. "Numbers!" Grakthol roared into his communicator, his mandibles clicking rapidly with agitation. "Unknown, sir. New contacts are still appearing. Current count exceeds 15,000 vessels, and rising." Admiral Chun remained motionless at the center of the diplomatic chamber, her hands still clasped behind her back, that infuriating smile never wavering. She watched Grakthol's growing distress with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. 15,000, she remarked conversationally. "Actually, the final count should stabilize at approximately 22,416 vessels. We've been preparing for this encounter for quite some time." Grakthol spun toward her, his 4 arms flexing unconsciously. "Impossible. Your species lacks the industrial capacity to construct such a fleet. Our intelligence reports indicated no more than 300 vessels in your entire navy." Chen's smile brightened, and, for the first time since entering the chamber, she laughed, a sound as warm and genuine as if she were sharing a pleasant memory with an old friend. "Oh, Warlord, your intelligence was absolutely correct. The United Earth Defense Force does indeed operate approximately 300 vessels." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Those would be the ones you detected during your reconnaissance missions." The implications hit Grakthol like a fusion torpedo to the brain. "Decoy vessels," he whispered, his voice hoarse with growing comprehension. "Partially correct," Chun confirmed with the pleased tone of a teacher whose student was beginning to grasp a complex lesson. "Those ships are quite real and functional. They simply represent a very small fraction of Earth's actual capabilities. You see, when we realized that first contact with your empire was inevitable, we made a collective decision as a species." More alarms began blaring throughout the ship as additional sensor contacts materialized. The tactical display now resembled a 3-dimensional web of blue indicators, with Kethvar vessels trapped like insects in an impossible geometric pattern. "What decision?" Grakthol demanded, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. "We decided to become very, very good at building spaceships," Chen replied with the same cheerful tone she might have used to discuss a hobby. "It turns out that when you give 7 billion humans a common goal and unlimited motivation, they can accomplish quite remarkable things." Fleet Admiral Vextar's voice crackled through the communicator again, now tinged with desperation. "Warlord, the humans are not moving to attack positions. They're just waiting. All vessels remain at minimal power, weapons offline. I don't understand their strategy." Grakthol's secondary hearts were beating so rapidly He could feel them hammering against his ribcage. In all his years of combat, he had never encountered an enemy that revealed superior force without immediately pressing their advantage. It violated every principle of sound military doctrine. "What are you waiting for?" he growled at Chun, his voice dropping to a threatening rumble that had once made entire planetary governments surrender unconditionally. Chen's expression shifted slightly, the pleasant smile transforming into something more complex. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of genuine sadness that was somehow more unsettling than any threat. "We're waiting for you to understand," she said softly. "You see, Warlord, humanity studied your empire very carefully during the 18 months between first contact and this meeting. We learned about your tactics, your technology, your history of conquest across the galaxy." She began to pace slowly around the chamber, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the metal deck plating. Her two guards remained motionless, but Grakthal noticed their eyes tracking every Kethvar warrior in the room with mechanical precision. "We learned about the Veltar hegemony," Chun continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting historical facts. "A spacefaring civilization that controlled 47 star systems before your empire encountered them. They possessed energy shields that could deflect your primary weapons and had developed psionic warfare techniques that could disable your crews from extreme range." Grakthal's eyes narrowed. The Veltar campaign had been one of the most challenging in Kethvar history, requiring nearly a full cycle to complete conquest. "Yet they fell within 2 years, Chen observed, stopping directly in front of his throne-like command chair. "Not because you overpowered their defenses, but because you studied their psychology and used it against them. You discovered that their psionic warriors required meditation periods to maintain their abilities, so you launched coordinated attacks during their religious observances. You learned that their culture valued individual achievement above collective action, so you targeted their most accomplished commanders for assassination, creating chaos in their command structure." The human's eyes met his three with unwavering directness. "You won that war not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of your enemy's nature." "Your point?" Grakthal demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The point, Warlord, is that we learned from your example," Chen replied. "When faced with an enemy possessing superior military technology and vast numerical advantages, the logical response is not to challenge them in areas where they excel. The logical response is to study them until you understand their fundamental weaknesses." Fleet Admiral Vextar's voice interrupted again, now carrying a note of barely controlled terror. "Sir, we're receiving communication requests from every human vessel simultaneously. They're not using standard military frequencies. They're broadcasting on civilian channels, entertainment networks, even our personal communicators. How did they obtain our encryption protocols?" Chen's smile returned, brighter than ever. "We've been monitoring your communications for the past 14 months, Warlord. Every tactical discussion, every strategic planning session, every personal conversation among your crew. Did you know that Subcommander Thakmore in your engineering section has been embezzling funds to pay for recreational stimulants? Or that Fleet Admiral Vextar has been conducting an unauthorized romantic relationship with Communications Officer Zelhan in violation of military regulations?" Grakthal's mandibles clamped shut with an audible click. The humans had demonstrated intelligence capabilities that went far beyond anything their primitive technology should have allowed. But that realization paled in comparison to a more disturbing implication. "If you've been monitoring us for months," he said slowly, "then you know everything about our fleet composition, our weapons systems, our tactical doctrines." "Oh, we know much more than that," Chen assured him warmly. "We know that Kethvar warriors require a specific amino acid supplement that your bodies cannot synthesize naturally. We know the frequencies that disrupt your cybernetic implants. We know that your species experiences severe psychological distress when separated from your pack hierarchies for extended periods." She gestured toward the viewing ports where the impossible fleet continued to materialize in perfect formation around the Kethvar vessels. "We know that your entire military doctrine is based on the assumption that other species will respond to superior force with either submission or conventional resistance. You've never encountered an enemy that simply refused to play by your rules. The tactical display updated again, and Gracthal felt his primary nervous system flood with stress chemicals as he processed what he was seeing. The human vessels weren't just surrounding his fleet, they were forming geometric patterns that defied military logic. Ships were positioning themselves in complex mathematical arrangements that served no apparent tactical purpose, but created an oddly hypnotic visual effect. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the constant stream of increasingly panicked reports from his fleet commanders. Chun followed his gaze to the tactical display, her expression brightening as if she were admiring a particularly beautiful work of art. "We're demonstrating a fundamental difference in our approaches to conflict resolution," she explained cheerfully. "Your species responds to challenges with immediate aggression, seeking to overwhelm opposition through superior force and intimidation. It served you well against civilizations that operate under similar psychological parameters." The patterns on the display continued to evolve, human ships moving with clockwork precision to form increasingly complex geometries. As Gracthal watched, he began to recognize mathematical sequences in their movements, fractals, spirals, patterns that seemed to follow laws of physics and mathematics rather than military doctrine. Humanity, however, evolved under very different circumstances. Chun continued. "We're persistence hunters, Warlord. When we encounter a problem we cannot solve through direct confrontation, we study it. We analyze it. We map every detail of its behavior until we understand exactly how it functions." Her voice took on a note of gentle instruction, as if she were explaining something obvious to a particularly slow student. "And then we create a solution so comprehensive, so perfectly adapted to that specific problem, that resistance becomes not just futile, but literally impossible." The geometric patterns on the tactical display had reached a critical complexity, and Gracthal suddenly realized what he was seeing. The human vessels weren't just surrounding his fleet. They were creating a three-dimensional maze of unprecedented sophistication. Every possible escape route had been not just blocked, but incorporated into the overall design in a way that turned attempted flight into further entrapment. "My engineers estimate it would take your fleet approximately 437 years to navigate clear of our formation," Chen informed him casually. "That's assuming perfect coordination, no mechanical failures, and absolutely no interference from our vessels during the escape attempt." Fleet Admiral Vextar's voice cut through the communications array one final time, and for the first time in his distinguished military career, the veteran commander's words were barely coherent. "Warlord, sir, I don't know how to report this. They're not just blocking our escape routes. They're singing." Chen's smile transformed into something radiant and joyful, the expression of someone witnessing a moment of perfect artistic achievement. "Ah," she said softly, "they've begun the second movement." As if summoned by her words, a new sound began to penetrate the bone crusher's hull. Not the mechanical vibrations of engines or weapons systems, but something organic and complex. 22,000 human vessels had begun broadcasting a coordinated musical performance, their transmissions blending together into a harmony that resonated through the quantum substrate of space itself. Gracthal's enhanced hearing could detect layers within the music, mathematical relationships between frequencies that spoke to something deeper than conscious thought. It was beautiful in a way that his warrior's mind had no framework to process, and terrifying in its implications of coordination and planning that spanned impossible scales of space and time. "What is this?" he managed to whisper, his forearms trembling with involuntary responses to stimuli his nervous system couldn't categorize. Admiral Chun stood perfectly still at the center of the chaos, her eyes closed as if savoring a favorite melody. When she spoke, her voice carried the reverent tone of someone describing a religious experience. "This, Warlord Gracthal, is what happens when you threaten the children of a species that spent 10,000 years learning to make music together in the dark. The music penetrated every surface of the bone crusher, resonating through the quantum foundation of matter itself in ways that Kethvar science had never achieved. It wasn't merely sound transmitted through conventional speakers. The harmonics were somehow integrated into the fabric of space-time around the fleet, creating sympathetic vibrations that made the massive warship's hull sing like a tuning fork. Grakthul's cybernetic implants began producing error messages as their frequency dampeners struggled to process auditory input that operated outside their program parameters. Throughout the ship, similar malfunctions cascaded through every electronic system as human music interacted with Kethvar technology in ways that violated fundamental assumptions about how matter and energy behaved. "Sir, we're receiving reports from every vessel in the fleet," Communications Officer Zelhan announced, her voice tight with confusion. "The human transmissions are somehow affecting our navigational computers. Our quantum guidance systems are interpreting the music as space-time distortion data." Admiral Chen opened her eyes and regarded Grakthul with an expression of profound sympathy, as if she genuinely regretted the necessity of what was occurring around them. "Your technology is quite impressive," she acknowledged with the tone of someone offering a sincere compliment. "The quantum entanglement networks you use for fleet coordination represent centuries of scientific advancement. But there's a fundamental vulnerability in any system that relies on precise frequency modulation for data transmission." She gestured toward the tactical display, where the geometric patterns formed by human vessels had evolved into something that hurt to look at directly. The formations shifted through configurations that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, creating optical illusions that made Grakthul's enhanced visual processing systems stutter and lag. "When you introduce harmonic interference at exactly the right frequencies," Chun continued conversationally, "those quantum networks begin to interpret music as navigation data, tactical information, even direct neural interface commands. It's really quite elegant from an engineering perspective." The music swelled around them, reaching a crescendo that seemed impossible given the vacuum of space. 22,000 human vessels sang together with perfect coordination, their combined voices creating harmonics that resonated through dimensions Kethvar science barely acknowledged existed. "Ow!" Grakthul managed to gasp, his multiple respiratory systems struggling to function as the musical frequencies interacted with his enhanced physiology in ways that produced involuntary neural responses. "Mathematics, mostly," Chin replied with the casual tone of someone discussing a mildly interesting hobby. "Your species experiences auditory stimuli differently than humans, but the underlying quantum mechanics are universal. We simply calculated the precise frequencies required to create constructive interference with your technology and destructive interference with your cognitive processes." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something beyond the music that surrounded them. "Actually, that's not quite accurate. We didn't perform those calculations ourselves. We asked our computers to solve the problem, and then we built everything they told us to build." The implication struck Grakthul like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just studied Kethvar technology. They had developed artificial intelligence systems sophisticated enough to design countermeasures for equipment that represented the pinnacle of galactic military engineering. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cosmic symphony. "Our intelligence indicated that your computational systems were centuries behind galactic standards." Chen's smile took on a note of gentle correction, the expression of a teacher addressing a common misconception. "Your intelligence was accurate regarding our quantum processing capabilities," she confirmed. "Human computers can't approach the raw computational power of Kethvar systems, or those of most galactic civilizations for that matter." The music around them shifted into a new movement, and Grakthul felt his consciousness begin to fragment as harmonics designed specifically for Kethvar neurology created feedback loops in his enhanced cognitive implants. "But raw processing power," Chun continued, seemingly unaffected by acoustic warfare that was reducing the galaxy's most feared military commander to a state of neurological chaos, isn't the only measure of computational effectiveness. Sometimes the most elegant solutions come from systems that think differently rather than faster. Through the viewing ports, Grakthal could see his fleet writhing in what appeared to be a carefully choreographed dance. Kethvar warships, their navigational systems corrupted by musical interference, were beginning to move in patterns that matched the human formations. The galaxy's most feared military force was being transformed into participants in an artistic performance of unprecedented scale and complexity. "You see," Chun explained, her voice somehow remaining perfectly clear despite the acoustic chaos surrounding them. "When we realized that conventional military resistance was impossible, we approached the problem from a different angle. Instead of trying to build weapons that could destroy your ships, we built systems that could make your ships forget how to fight." The tactical display updated with new information that made Grakthal's primary eye water with strain. His fleet's formation was no longer recognizable as a military arrangement. Kethvar vessels had been seamlessly integrated into the human geometric patterns, their movements now contributing to mathematical relationships of staggering complexity. Fleet Admiral Vextar reporting. Came the voice through increasingly distorted communications. "Sir, our crews are... Sir, I don't know how to explain this. They're not responding to combat orders. When we try to target the human vessels, our weapons systems interpret the targeting commands as requests to join their musical performance." Chin nodded approvingly, as if a particularly challenging student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "The beauty of human neural architecture," she observed, "is that it evolved to find patterns in chaos and meaning in randomness. When we designed countermeasures for your technology, we didn't try to overpower it. We simply taught it to see our intentions as harmonious with its existing programming." The music reached another crescendo, and Grakthal felt his consciousness split into multiple streams as his enhanced neurology struggled to process information that had been crafted specifically to exploit the interface between Kethvar biology and cybernetic augmentation. "Stop," he managed to whisper, his forearms clenching involuntarily as waves of sensory overload crashed through his enhanced nervous system. "What do you want from us?" For the first time since entering the chamber, Chen's expression shifted to something approaching sadness. She stepped closer to his command throne, her movements carrying the gentle certainty of someone approaching a wounded animal. "That's exactly the right question, Warlord," she said softly. "And the answer is absolutely nothing." The word hung in the air between them like a physical object. In 7,000 years of conquest, no species had ever told the Kethvar Empire that they wanted nothing from them. The concept was so foreign to Grakthal's worldview that his enhanced mind simply couldn't process it. "Nothing," he repeated, his voice barely more than a breath. "Nothing at all," Chen confirmed with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious. "We don't want your territory, your resources, your technology, or your surrender. We don't seek to conquer your empire or convert your people to our way of thinking. We have absolutely no interest in becoming another galactic power struggling for dominance over star systems we've never seen." She gestured toward the viewing ports where the impossible concert continued, Kethvar and human vessels now moving together in patterns that seemed to describe mathematical truths about the nature of reality itself. "What we want, Warlord Grakthal, is for you to understand a simple message and carry it back to your empire. Can you do that for us?" The music around them began to fade, not stopping abruptly, but gradually transitioning into something softer and more peaceful. As the acoustic assault diminished, Grakthal felt his consciousness begin to reassemble itself, his enhanced systems slowly coming back online as the harmonic interference decreased. What message?" he gasped, his multiple respiratory systems working overtime to compensate for the neurological stress he had just endured. Chen's expression brightened into something radiant and genuinely warm, the smile of someone sharing wonderful news with a dear friend. "The message is very simple," she said, her voice carrying the cheerful certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. Humanity is not interested in playing galactic conquest games with civilizations that have had thousands of years to perfect the art of war. She clasped her hands behind her back again, resuming the relaxed posture she had maintained throughout their encounter. We're much more interested in playing entirely different games with rules that we write ourselves. The music faded to silence, but the geometric patterns formed by human and Kethvar vessels remained intact. Through the tactical display, Grakthul could see that his entire fleet was now part of a three-dimensional mandala of staggering mathematical complexity, each ship positioned with precision that suggested calculation capabilities beyond anything his empire had achieved. "Your fleet will remain operational," Chen informed him conversationally. "Your crews are unharmed, your ships undamaged, your weapons systems fully functional. In approximately 6 hours, the harmonic interference will fade completely, and your navigational systems will return to normal operation." She paused, her expression taking on a note of gentle instruction. "However, every quantum navigation computer in your fleet has been provided with detailed specifications for the technologies demonstrated today. Your engineers will be able to reverse engineer our techniques, understand our methods, and even improve upon them if they're clever enough." Grakthul's eyes widened as the implications hit him. "You're giving us your weapons technology?" "Oh no," Chen replied with a laugh that seemed to sparkle with genuine amusement. "We're giving you something much more dangerous than weapons, Warlord." Her smile transformed into something that made Grakthul's enhanced survival instincts flood his system with stress hormones for the third time during their encounter. "We're giving you better ideas." The silence that followed Chen's words was more unsettling than the cosmic symphony that had preceded it. Throughout the Bone Crusher, Kethvar crew members stood motionless at their stations, staring at displays that showed their fleet transformed into something resembling a work of art more than a military formation. The geometric precision of their new arrangement spoke to mathematical principles that their warrior culture had never prioritized, yet somehow felt fundamentally correct in ways that bypassed rational thought. "Better ideas," Grakthul repeated slowly, his voice hoarse from the neurological strain he had endured. His enhanced mind was already beginning to process the implications of what the humans had demonstrated, and each conclusion was more disturbing than the last. Admiral Chun nodded with the pleased expression of someone whose student was finally grasping a complex lesson. "Consider what you've witnessed today, Warlord. 22,000 vessels operating in perfect coordination without a single hierarchical command structure. Mathematical precision achieved through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed discipline. Technological integration that enhances individual capabilities rather than replacing them with artificial systems." She gestured toward the tactical display where Kethvar and human ships continued to maintain their impossible formation despite the absence of any apparent controlling intelligence. "Your empire has spent 7,000 years perfecting the art of imposing order through superior force," Chen continued, her tone carrying the gentle certainty of someone explaining obvious truths. "But there are other ways to achieve coordination, Warlord. Other methods of organizing complex systems that don't require constant application of external pressure." Grakthul's 3 eyes tracked the display as he struggled to understand what he was seeing. His fleet maintained perfect formation despite the fact that individual ship commanders were reporting complete autonomy over their vessels' movements. No central authority was issuing navigation commands, yet every ship moved in precise harmony with its neighbors. "How?" he whispered, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. "Emergence," Chen replied with the satisfied tone of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. "When you create the right initial conditions and provide appropriate information flow between individual units, complex systems can organize themselves into patterns more sophisticated than any centralized intelligence could design." She walked slowly around the diplomatic chamber, her soft footsteps somehow audible despite the background noise of ship operations. Her 2 guards remained perfectly still, but Gracthal noticed that their positioning created subtle geometric relationships that mirrored the formations visible on the tactical display. Your Empire's approach to organization is based on pyramid structures, Chen observed conversationally. Authority flows downward from apex commanders to subordinate units, with each layer of hierarchy responsible for controlling the layer beneath it. It's an efficient system for imposing predetermined patterns of behavior across large populations. The musical harmonics had faded completely, but Gracthal could still feel their aftereffects resonating through his enhanced nervous system. His cybernetic implants were producing analysis reports that made no sense. His fleet's current formation was simultaneously more complex and more stable than anything Kethvar military doctrine had ever achieved. But hierarchical systems have inherent limitations, Chun continued, her voice taking on the instructional tone of someone delivering a well-rehearsed lecture. They can only be as intelligent as their apex decision-makers, and they become increasingly fragile as they scale to larger sizes. More importantly, they require constant energy expenditure to maintain their imposed patterns of organization. She stopped directly in front of his command throne, her eyes meeting his three with unwavering directness. Emergent systems, by contrast, become more intelligent as they grow larger, more stable as they encounter external pressures, and they maintain their organization through internal harmony rather than external force. Fleet Admiral Vextar's voice crackled through the communications array, now carrying a note of wonder rather than panic. Warlord, our tactical computers have analyzed the current formation. The defensive capabilities of our new arrangement exceed anything in our strategic databases. If we were to come under attack while maintaining these positions, our combined firepower would be focused through geometric amplification principles that multiply our effective range by factors of. His voice trailed off, and when it returned, it carried the stunned tone of someone who couldn't quite believe their own calculations. Sir, our effective combat power has increased by approximately 4,000%. Chen's smile brightened with genuine pleasure, as if she were sharing good news with a close friend. Mathematical amplification through resonance cascades, she explained cheerfully. When you position energy sources according to specific geometric relationships, their outputs don't simply add together. They multiply through constructive interference patterns. Gracthal's mandibles clicked involuntarily as his combat-trained mind processed the implications. The humans hadn't just neutralized his fleet, they had transformed it into something far more powerful than the sum of its individual components. But why? He demanded, his voice rising with confusion and growing frustration. Why give us capabilities that exceed our original strength? Why make us more dangerous than we were before? For the first time during their encounter, Chen's expression shifted to something approaching sadness. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of genuine regret that was somehow more unsettling than any threat. Because, Warlord, we want you to understand what you've been throwing away. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, the chamber seemed to spin around him as concepts that had never occurred to his warrior's mind suddenly crystallized with painful clarity. For 7,000 years, Chun continued softly, your empire has encountered species after species, each possessing unique insights, novel approaches to problems, creative solutions that had never been tried before. And your response to this incredible diversity of thought has been to eliminate it in favor of imposed uniformity. She gestured toward the viewing ports where human vessels continued their impossible coordination with Kethvar warships. Every species you've conquered represented a different way of understanding reality. Every civilization you've absorbed possessed knowledge that could have enhanced your own capabilities in ways you never imagined. Every culture you've destroyed held solutions to problems your empire hasn't even encountered yet. The tactical display updated with new information that made Gracthal's enhanced visual processing system struggle to comprehend what they were seeing. The geometric patterns formed by the combined fleets were evolving, becoming more complex and sophisticated with each passing moment despite the absence of any directing intelligence. The Veltar hegemony psionic techniques could have been integrated with your cybernetic systems to create hybrid consciousness networks of unprecedented capability, Chun observed, her voice taking on the tone of someone describing lost opportunities. The Crystalline Confederacy's mineral-based computing systems could have revolutionized your artificial intelligence development. The hive minds of Kepler 442 possessed distributed decision-making processes that could have solved coordination problems your empire struggles with daily. Each example struck Gracthal like a separate weapon as he began to understand the magnitude of what his people had discarded in their pursuit of conquest and uniformity. Instead, Chun continued, her expression shifting to something that resembled profound disappointment. You've spent 7 millennia turning the galaxy into a mirror of yourselves, eliminating alternatives in favor of familiar patterns, choosing imposed order over voluntary cooperation. The formations around them continued to evolve, and Gracthal realized with growing amazement that his crews were now actively participating in a mathematical dance. Kethvar warriors, trained from birth to follow hierarchical command structures, were somehow coordinating their movements through principles they didn't understand to achieve results that exceeded their wildest tactical fantasies. Your crews are adapting to emergent coordination protocols, Chen observed with the pleased tone of someone whose experiment was proceeding exactly as planned. They're discovering that voluntary cooperation can achieve results that forced compliance never could. And they're beginning to understand that diversity of thought enhances collective capability rather than threatening it. Communications Officer Zelhan's voice cut through the chamber's audio systems, carrying a note of excitement that Gracthal had never heard from any member of his crew. Sir, engineering reports that the humans have shared technical specifications for their resonance amplification systems. Subcommander Thakmore says that if we integrate these principles with our existing quantum networks, we could revolutionize everything from faster-than-light communication to energy distribution throughout the Empire. Chen nodded with satisfaction, as if a particularly challenging student had finally solved a difficult problem. That's just the beginning, she assured them. The specifications we've provided represent basic applications of mathematical principles that your scientists will be able to extend in directions we haven't even considered. When you return to Kethvar space, your engineers will have enough information to begin a technological revolution that could transform your entire civilization. Gracthal felt something fundamental shifting in his worldview as the implications became clear. The humans weren't offering him better weapons or more efficient methods of conquest. They were offering something far more subversive, proof that there were ways of organizing society that were more powerful than the systems his empire had spent millennia perfecting. And you expect us to simply abandon 7,000 years of successful expansion? He asked, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Chen's expression brightened into something radiant with possibility, the smile of someone about to share wonderful news. Oh no, Warlord, she replied with sparkling enthusiasm. We expect you to become better at it than you've ever imagined possible. Her words hung in the air as the geometric patterns around them reached a new level of complexity. Through the viewing ports, Gracthal could see formations that seemed to extend beyond three-dimensional space, creating optical effects that spoke to hidden dimensions of reality his people had never learned to perceive. Imagine, Chun continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality of someone describing a beautiful vision. What your empire could accomplish if instead of destroying the civilizations you encounter, you invited them to contribute their unique capabilities to collective projects of unprecedented ambition. The tactical display shifted to show new configurations as human and Kethvar vessels began experimenting with formations that incorporated both species' technological strengths. Imagine the problems you could solve if you had access to the combined knowledge of every intelligent species in the galaxy, all working together voluntarily toward goals that enhanced everyone's capabilities rather than subordinating some for the benefit of others. Fleet Admiral Vexstar's voice returned to the communications array, now carrying an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. Warlord, the mathematical principles the humans have shared with us. If we apply them to our expansion protocols, we could achieve coordination across hundreds of star systems simultaneously. Our empire could grow faster and more efficiently than ever before, but through integration rather than conquest. Chin's smile had transformed into something that made Grakthol's enhanced survival instincts flood his nervous system with chemicals his warrior's mind couldn't identify. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something far more complex. The recognition that he was in the presence of something that operated according to rules he had never learned to comprehend. "You see, Warlord," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle certainty of someone stating obvious truth. "Humanity doesn't want to stop the Kethvar Empire from expanding across the galaxy." She paused, her expression taking on notes of anticipation and barely contained excitement. "We want to teach you how to expand into dimensions you didn't know existed." As if summoned by her words, the formations around them underwent one final transformation. The geometric patterns that had contained and coordinated over 22,000 vessels suddenly collapsed inward, not disappearing, but folding themselves into configurations that seemed to exist in mathematical spaces beyond conventional physics. For a moment that lasted eternity, Grakthul glimpsed something that his enhanced mind could barely process, a vision of galactic civilization organized according to principles of voluntary cooperation and emergent complexity, spreading not just across star systems, but through dimensions of reality that conquest-based thinking could never reach. And in that moment, for the first time in 7,000 years of unbroken military success, Warlord Grakthul understood that his empire had been playing a game so small that they had never realized how vast the actual playing field could be. Admiral Chun stood perfectly still at the center of the revelation, her smile warm and welcoming and absolutely terrifying in its implications of changes that would reshape everything he thought he knew about power, control, and what it meant to be truly strong. "Welcome to the real game, Warlord," she said softly. "We're very much looking forward to seeing what you can accomplish when you understand the actual rules."